always, we're happy to have this number with us for our period of worship this afternoon. We thank you for your presence and for your participation. We're lucky to have such a beautiful day in which to assemble. We know that there's illness among us and sadness among us and other things that could keep us away, but we appreciate your willingness and your prioritizing your time to be able to come and be here. This afternoon we sang some songs about the providence of God, about the way God, in many, many ways, maybe even some unknown to us, that He will take care of us and make sure that the things we need are provided. And what I'd like for us to do is to use this as a kind of a springboard for our study tonight, which is the book of Esther. We're doing this study where we took a book each time, starting with the book of Genesis and working our way through the Bible. We have made it through Ezra and Nehemiah, and now we're at Esther. Interesting book, this Esther. It's not one that you study much. It's pretty much a historical account, and the things that we find here are all related to a couple of ongoing stories. I thought as I was reading through this, a couple of times, that it would make a good movie. It would make an excellent movie with plots intervening, and all kinds of subplots going on, and would be a very uplifting movie because it turns out good for the people of God. But let's start off by looking at the book itself, and we're going to call this the role model of Esther. Esther becomes a good role model for people today, both men and women. Mostly women, though, because she is a woman, but she is basically she's a success story, if you will. She's a Jewish girl who becomes queen of Persia. Nothing is outside of the bounds of occurrence with God, and this Esther is a girl who just happens to be in the right place at the right time, and through the providence of God, she brings to bear some very important principles, and in fact, she, at great risk to her own life, intercedes for her people in the land of Persia. She intercedes for the Jews and saves her people. Now, just think about a little history here. This book is written at a time when the people of Judah are captives during that 70 years of captivity in Babylon. Well, which is no longer Babylon. It's been taken over by the Medo-Persians, but in the Persian Empire, they're still captives. And unfortunately, there are some things taking place while they're captive here where the enemies of the people of Judah are about to take over. They're about to wipe out the Jews entirely, and we'll see that as the story develops. But as we first of all just look at the progression of the story itself, if you'll turn to the book of Esther, we don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on just the story itself, so we'll kind of run through the high points here. And remember that this is during the time when the Persians are in full power. The king is a man named Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus, depending on how you see those marks. But he's also known as Xerxes, another name for him. I think that's the Persian name. The immediate name is this Ahasuerus, and he reigns over a large area, the known world at the time, really. And when he's reigning, he is the boss, no doubt about it. He is the one who has all authority, and to even challenge that authority is to risk sudden death. So keep that in mind as we progress through the story. So here's the basic story that we come across. The story of Esther involves, first of all, the present king and queen. Ahasuerus, his queen to begin with, is Queen Vashti. I'm sorry, I see a long I there, so I'm going to try to include that. Vashti is his king, or his queen. And Vashti was present during this reign, and she occupied the position of queen of Persia. This is during that 70 years of captivity. And remember that God had prophesied to his people the Jews, the ones from Judah, that after 70 years they would return to their homeland. So it would be important to know how God preserves them and how He keeps them as a people so they can return to their homeland. The king has a 7-day feast, and also his wife hosts a feast for the women of the royal party. We find this in the first chapter. The first 9 verses tell us about this great feast that the king made. It was a fancy thing with all kinds of beautiful decorations and all that. Verse 9 tells us that Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. And on the 7th day of that feast, strange thing happened. Not really strange, I guess, but the king decided to show off his wife. As queen, she was beautiful. She was most excellent as a queen, and he wanted to show her off. And she did something almost unthinkable. Starting in verse 10, we're told that on this 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, that verse 11 says he had his princes to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. So the king was a fancier of this beautiful aspect of his queen. But verse 12 tells us something that you don't often hear about. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. And the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice. They said, what are you going to do? Verse 15, what shall we do to Queen Vashti? According to law, she did not obey the command of the king to be brought before him. And here was their thinking. This is kind of a little bit of a venture into the culture of the time. The reigning men were scared. Verse 17 says, verse 16, before all the king and the princes and all that, it was said, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. When they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come in. You see what they're saying? Well, this is bad, because if word gets out of how the queen bucked the king's instructions, then all the women in the country will start to revolt. Well, that was their thinking anyway. So they came up with this plan for the king to make a decree, and he's first of all going to banish the queen. Verse 19 of that chapter tells us, Vashti shall no longer come before Queen Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. She was already most beautiful to behold, so that wouldn't be an issue, but most better than she would be one who obeyed better, I suppose. And of course, here's the reasoning. When the king's decree which he will make is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it's great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. That'll fix the problem, won't it? We'll put this outspoken woman to rest. She won't be queen anymore, and the other women in the country will be too scared to make any kind of opposition to their husband's command. So, that was done. She was banished as a warning to all the people in the province. In fact, verse 22 has an interesting way of putting it. The king released his report to the whole nation. He sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak the language of his own people. Well, that didn't last long, did it? Here we are a few centuries later, and I don't know. If you're the master in your house, raise your hand, guys. But that's the thinking of this king and his people. All right, so then the quest was on to find a new queen. A search to replace Queen Vashti was begun. Turn over the 2nd chapter, and the first few verses tell us about all the country was to be sought for beautiful young virgins sought for the king. And they were to gather them together, and it was a very involved process. They were to be trained in the aspects of beauty for a year, and then brought before the king. In that country, in the place called Shushan, there was Mordecai. And Mordecai was a Jew. He was one of that captive group of Jews who were in the country. And he had this beautiful cousin, the daughter of his uncle. And verse 7 tells us that he had brought up this girl, whose name in the Jewish was Hadassah. Hadassah was her name, that is Esther. And it says she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Okay, so we're looking here at some providence. Esther, as we know her, was without family, and Mordecai, her kinsman, took her in and treated her as he would his own daughter. So the providence of God was at work there. As he took care of her, she was also numbered among these beautiful women of the kingdom. Ultimately, she was selected to replace Queen Vashti. Reading on through the second chapter, several verses there, many preparations were made, and these beautiful young maidens were brought before the king. And the only thing was that if you check out verse 10 there of chapter 2, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. So she had not revealed the fact that she was a Jew. As far as anybody knew, she was just another one of the Persian women who was striving to be king. And sure enough, all the preparations were made, everything was brought to be, and when she was presented to the king, verse 17 of that chapter tells us, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all virgins, so he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Okay, she has now become queen in Vashti's place. That name, Esther, that's a Persian name, and it comes from the word for star. Estrella is the Persian name for a star. And here she is wearing that name, Esther, the star, and she's certainly fulfilling that role. But remember that this is part of God's plan. We want to kind of look between the lines, and we're being given some scenario here that is setting the stage for something very, very spiritual in nature. All right, so she is selected to replace Queen Vashti. She did not reveal that she was a Jew. Okay, we've already talked about that. Meanwhile, Mordecai, her uncle, or her cousin, comes along and is very, very fortunately, providentially, I believe, made aware of a plot against the king. Let's read just a few verses there from the second chapter, beginning in verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So these two eunuchs had conspired to do harm to the king. News of it came to Mordecai, who passed that along through the queen, and those perpetrators were punished. Good news for the king, at least. And ultimately, good news for Mordecai, too, as we'll see in just a moment. But that plot he thwarted then and saved the king's life. So a little bit of time passes, and there comes on the scene a character named Haman. In the third chapter, the first few verses, we're told about Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, yeah. And somehow he advanced in the king's court, and he became a very high-ranking prince. And he was so high-ranking that all the others had to pay homage to him. They would have to bow down before him and give him due reverence and all that. But verse 2 tells us, but Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. his Jewish roots, his character as one of the tribe of Judah, was that you don't bow down to people. God is the one who is reserved for that. So he didn't. And of course, Mordecai was not liking that at all. As far as down at verse 5, we're told that when Haman saw Mordecai did not bow down or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. Haman did not like that at all. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He didn't want to single out some poor individual. Instead, look at verse 6 there. Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So he hatched a plan. And his plan was to get Ahasuerus to authorize the killing of all the Jews. And of course, Haman came to the king and said, look, there's a certain people scattered all throughout your kingdom, and they're different from everybody else. They're immigrants. Okay? They're different, he said. And he also says that they don't keep the king's laws, and therefore it's not fitting for the king to let them remain. So let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And Haman even wrote into the decree that 10,000 talents of silver would be paid into the hands of those who work to bring it into the king's treasury. So the king made the decree. Letters were sent out to all the king's provinces to destroy, look at verse 13 of chapter 3 there, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. All the above was to be done to the Jews. Destroy them, kill them, and annihilate them. Both young and old, little children and women, in one day, and the day was picked for that to happen. It was the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And they were going to be plundering all their possessions too. All right, so that decree was set in place, and Mordecai heard about it, and he recognized that his people were in danger. 4th chapter of the book tells us about Mordecai mourning this. He's sitting at the gate of the city, mourning in sackcloth and ashes, and the first 3 verses there tell us how that he could not approach the king himself. He was not of stature enough to go before the king, so many of the Jews were mourning, sackcloth and ashes, fasting, weeping, praying. And Esther's maids and eunuch came to her. They told her about this. And of course she was deeply distressed. Now she hadn't told anyone else about being a Jew, but she knew who she was, and this was her people who were in danger. Esther hears about it, and she learns of Haman's plan to kill all the Jews. So for a little bit there in chapter 4, we read about how Esther hatches up a plan. And it involves a couple of feasts that she invites Haman and Mordecai to. And Mordecai actually convinced Esther to go before the king in a most dangerous mission. In chapter 4 there, about verse 10, it was not approved for even the queen to go before the king without being summoned. You just didn't go and say, knock, 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 king, may I come in? It wasn't that way. The king had to summon you and point his scepter at you to let you even come in to talk to him. And he has but one law, and that is to put to death anyone who tries to approach him without proper authority. Well, Esther was a little afraid to do this, but look at this in verse 13. They told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai says, you go back and tell Esther this. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. He said, don't kid yourself. Somebody's going to know that you're a Jew, and you'll be in the number that are going to be put to death. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Here Mordecai is I think, invoking the idea that maybe this is God's plan. Interestingly, here in the book of Esther, you don't find God's name at all. The name of God's never mentioned in this book. But the thought of God's providence is there all the time. And so here's what Haman told the people to tell Esther. He says, what about you having come to the kingdom just for a time like this, when you can stand up and take charge, and even at your own risk, put some plot to rest that would cause the death of all your people. And so he gives her the idea that she should do this. Well, Esther made her plan, and her plan involved getting an audience before the king, and she encourages the king, convinces him to have this banquet where Haman comes, and there's a petition made. Now, the thing is, Haman is still angry at Mordecai because he won't bow down to him. So one of the things that Haman thought he would be able to do would be to get the king to authorize the hanging of Mordecai. So he had a gallows built for him. And at this banquet, Haman planned to petition the king for the opportunity to kill Mordecai. So in chapter 5, down through most of it there, Mordecai has this gallows built, and he's just certain that the king's going to let him hang Mordecai for not bowing down to him. Well, in the meantime, and I guess providence would be what I would say is happening here, the king was, the night before the banquet, was reading through the archives, the historical records of his kingdom. Guess what he came across? He came across this record of how Mordecai had stopped the plot against him years ago, and how nothing had been done to honor him. Well, that's a fortunate turn. Mordecai had saved the king's life and the kingdom, but nothing had been done to honor Mordecai for this great act. Chapter 6 tells us about that. It was found written there about what Mordecai had done and how he thwarted that plot by the servants to kill him. Haman didn't know about this. At the banquet, down to verse 6 of chapter 6, Haman came in and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now, Haman is so full of himself, he thinks the king's talking about him. And so he says, "Oh, me? You're going to honor me. I'm your favorite here." And he thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" Well, I think that's kind of silly, but he thought that way. And Haman answered the king, he said, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has the royal crest on its head. Do all these honors to the man, and honor him in that way." And then verse 10, then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate." Haman is not getting what he thought. Mordecai is about to get the reward for all of that. Well, nothing had been done to honor Mordecai, now it is. Haman was so very angry about this that throughout the rest of that 6th chapter tells us how terrible Haman began to hate Mordecai. And so he begins hatching a plot to have Mordecai killed. In fact, his plan to kill all the Jews was still in place. Esther reveals that plot to the king. In chapter 7, the first few verses, Esther does gain access again to go before the king, and she tells the king the nature of this plot. Verses 3 and 4, "O king, let my life be given me at my petition, my people at my request, for we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. We've been sold as slaves. I never have held my tongue," she said, "before this would happen." And so King Ahasuerus asked Esther, "Who is he? And where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" She said, "It's your adversary and enemy, this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the queen and the king. It all ends up that Haman was hanged on the gallows that was meant for Mordecai. A clever turn of events, and one that stopped the plot. Now, remember that the decree had already been sent out across the country that on the 5th day of this last month of the year, or whatever day it was, that the Jews were all to be killed, and there were people out there still ready to do that. So when we get to the 8th chapter, Mordecai is exalted, and a plan to save the Jews is put in place. The king had letters sent out that said Haman is now dead. This decree undoes what he said to do about killing the Jews. And also in verse 11 of chapter 8, by these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them. Those three words keep popping up. That's what the Jews were now allowed to do to stop this intrusion against their people. So Mordecai was the leader of that. Now, later on, Mordecai is promoted. And by the time we get to the end of chapter 8, he's a man of high stature. The Jews are spared. Their enemies are destroyed. Esther and Mordecai institute a feast among the Jews, which is even somewhat observed nowadays. It's called the Feast of Purim, to commemorate the Jews' deliverance from this terrible evil. Mordecai the Jew becomes second to King Ahasuerus of Persia. And we'll turn over to the 10th chapter, and the last verse of that chapter tells us here, for Mordecai the Jew was second to the king Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. Well, that's the story. The book of Esther pretty much tells us this story, how the extermination of the Jews was prevented. But I'd like to take just a moment, we have just 2 minutes left, and let's go ahead and look at some of the things that pertain to Esther as character. Just think about her. Esther is one who is known here for her great beauty. She was lovely and beautiful, the 2nd chapter says. Okay, well, that could have afforded her some stature. Don't we do that today? Those celebrities who are lovely and beautiful and usually young and so on, they're afforded celebrity status. Everybody looks up to them. But also, Esther was prepared. In the 2nd chapter, there was this 12-month preparation period. She had to learn how to behave as a beautiful person within the bounds of that kingdom. It wasn't that she just knew how. And I'm thinking that's something to think about today, too. Even those among us in our culture who are beautiful and respected for that need to be taught how to behave, don't they? I mean, that's really something. You see folks who are celebrities just because their looks and maybe their acting ability or something is pretty good, but they don't have a clue about how to behave as responsible people in a normal society. Well, that was part of this training. They were trained to be beautified. And she obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. She put that to good use, and everybody was aware of this great treasure that she was. In fact, Ahasuerus loved her above all other women. That's why he chose her as his king. So, there is some benefit to great beauty that we can see here. Esther had it, and the use that it was put to was for good, and she did it properly. Now, notice this. She was also a woman of virtue. She was a virgin up to the time of her selection by the king. And that's something, too, that you have to think about. In our society today, sometimes both men and women who are celebrity status think that morals don't apply to them. That they don't have to follow any of the rules about behavior and sexual immorality and so on. They just do what they want to because they're stars after all. And we have to just go along and applaud them anyway for all the bad things they do. But not so with Esther. Even after she was selected to be among that special group of ladies being considered to be queens, she maintained her virtue. She took that to the extreme as well with honoring Mordecai as her father. In Exodus 20, verse 12, in the 10 Commandments, aren't we told there, honor your father and mother? That's the commandment with promise. If you do so, the Bible says, your days will be long upon the earth. Well, that's what Esther did. She followed his advice. He gave her good advice. He said, don't reveal your identity at the beginning of all this, and she did not. She remained in contact with him, too, even after she was elevated to the position of queen. she still kept in contact, and she knew what Mordecai was doing as this terrible calamity approached the Jews. She also showed faith in God's providence. Even though the name of God isn't mentioned here, she was aware of God, and what she chose to do reflected how she understood what Mordecai was talking about. And he said, "Perhaps you are here for such a time as this." She went ahead and took the difficult route and proclaimed to the king this plot that was against the Jews. She certainly took that, and she also called upon others to join her. We didn't talk about this, but in the 4th chapter, there is this great fasting which is brought together. We see this a lot in the Old Testament. Fasting. All the people coming together at Esther's bequest to pray, to fast, to beseech the powers of God in this matter. And she was willing to risk everything, her position, her life even, if necessary, as she approached the king without permission. You know, that was serious business back then. You didn't just violate the king's authority. And so she took a lot of risk to carry out her plans. How about to conclude with all this? What we're seeing here is how Esther provided, or proved rather, that she was more than just a pretty face. I like the way this turns out. Yes, no doubt and no downplay about her beauty. She was, and that's fine. But she was more than that. She was a model adult daughter. She was grown up, and yet she behaved in a way that brought honor to her father figure, Mordecai. And she was free to act as she chose, but she carefully weighed the advice that she got. Wouldn't it be nice if we had more adult daughters who took that approach and actually carefully weighed the advice of those who were their father and mother? She was also a model person of faith. Her faith was tremendous. She knew that if she behaved properly, that the right thing would be done and the people of Israel would be saved, the Jews. But she was devoted to God and His people. She proved herself to be a true daughter of Sarah. Remember back in Genesis chapter 12, when Abram took Sarai, his wife, down to Egypt, she was recognized as a person of great beauty. In fact, that was the danger. Abraham said, "I'm not going to say you're my wife, but you're too beautiful. If we go down there to Egypt, somebody will kill me just to get you." So he didn't say she was his wife. Well, he should have, because later on that brought some calamity to the Egyptians. But that was one thing. Sarah was beautiful on the outside, but more so, Esther was beautiful on the inside. The passage that we had Austin read from 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter. What did Peter say? "Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, putting on fine apparel. Rather let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God." And he goes on to talk about how this is how the women of old gave honor to their husbands and to God. So we get from this picture of Esther here the kind of a shadow of what's mentioned in the New Testament. To not let your beauty be the only thing you've got. Let it be the beauty of the Spirit inside, more so than on the outside. And when we think about that, it's not hard to see how Esther really provides a good role model. I would hope that as we study this, you're able to gather some of these ideas for usefulness in today's world. Esther lived a long time ago. She dealt with things that we don't have to deal with today. We don't have a king who chooses his wife from among a great bevy of attractive women. It's different than that in our society. But God's way is still there. And the songs we sang before the lesson tonight about God taking care of us, about God doing the things necessary that we need done, that's all important. We hope you'll consider this. And if you notice too, the song we're about to sing, number 612, describes how God's love can lift us above any of these situations. Although Esther was not walking in sin, she was still having trouble, and facing difficulties, and it was the love of God and His providence that lifted her above all that. Well, this song is kind of an invitation song as well. If you look at the last verse of it, He, your Savior, wants to be. God wants to be our Savior. Jesus wants to be our Savior. And what we need to do is let that love lift us until we obey, carry out His commands like we talked about this morning. We hope that you will take advantage of this